Okay, hello guys. Here's just a quick review of Chapter 1, the impact of World War One in Europe. Alright, so essentially this chapter has two main parts. Firstly, the Treaty of Versailles, and also about the League of Nations, which was in essence a creation of this particular treaty itself. So firstly, we're going to focus on the treaty over here, and okay, we're going to take a look. Alright, some background on it. Okay, I think you all know that it was a result of the Paris Peace Conference, essentially the end of World War One, and the Treaty of Versailles was there to help basically create a sort of a peace agreement, and it was also led by the big three, the USA, France, and Britain, and of course Germany, being the bad guy in World War One, was not invited to this particular treaty. So, in a way, it didn't have a position and it couldn't fight for anything when during the Paris Peace Conference. It didn't have the right to say anything about the terms. Okay, so now that we move on to the terms, all right, we're going to look at a few uh, terms over here, and what you can do is actually um, use a particular um, acronym for it, which is gargles. Okay, so like gargling water, but without the e in between. So gargles over here. So firstly, we look at the war guilt clause. So G over here for guilt. Okay, G for guilt. Okay, so firstly, of course, Germany being the one held responsible for World War One, had to accept total blame for World War One. Okay, had no say, and all the blame was placed squarely on German shoulders. And of course, because they accepted the blame, were forced to accept the blame. Rather, they had to pay reparations. Okay, which we'll talk about later on. Right, and then of course, the German armed forces were restricted. Okay, firstly, the army was reduced to 100,000 men. Okay, and this is really few, considering that in Singapore today, if we basically call up all our operationally ready forces, we will get about 300,000 or so men. So 100,000 for a country so much bigger than us is obviously a very small number. And also the Rhineland, okay, the area between France and Germany itself was demilitarized. So basically, no troops, no weapons. They weren't allowed to be stationed over here, although it was German territory and it bordered France. Okay, simply because if you think about it, it borders France, so basically it creates this buffer zone, so that France, will not face the threat of being invaded again by Germany. Also, conscription was banned, so the army was already so small, and basically the German government could not conscript soldiers. So conscription is like NS, okay, making young men join the military without them being able to choose to be in the military. So and of course, yes, conscription was basically banned. And finally, the German army was not allowed to have tanks, okay, which really weakened the German army. Also, it wasn't allowed to have an air force, and it wasn't allowed to have submarines. And essentially, its navy was restricted to basically a handful of battleships, which weren't really sufficient to defend itself. So if you think about all these, okay, the armed forces restrictions, think about how the Germans would feel, about the ability to defend themselves in the event of another war. Alright, and also, okay, going back to the topic of reparations, the R over here in gargles, okay, basically it was made to pay 6.6 billion pounds during that time, and 6.6 billion pounds then, it's not 6.6 billion pounds now. So it really was a lot of money. It's about $500 billion in today's, $500 billion US in today's estimates. And basically, what reparations would have done was to slow down German economic recovery, because a lot of the economic recovery, the money that they're going to make in subsequent years, would be given over to other countries, okay, in the form of reparations over here. So it slows down economic recovery, and also okay, we have links here over to territorial losses. So over here, German territorial losses, the G over here. Basically, places like the Polish corridor was given over to Poland. The SAR, SAAR, was also basically put under the control of the League of Nations. Okay, which basically in this SAR area, the SAAR, okay, basically had a lot of, was coal rich. So a lot of resources, but basically when it's taken away, given over to the League of Nations, essentially the Germans lost a source of income, which made it even more difficult to pay the reparations over here. And of course, Anschluss, which is union with Austria, was forbidden. And this was seen as quite unfair because Austria was also a German-speaking country. Alright, and finally, all overseas colonies in places like Africa and Asia, okay, were all given away. Basically, Germans, because they lost, or actually they didn't lose, they didn't actually surrender, but they were considered to, be guilty of causing World War One, had to give up all their overseas colonies. Alright, and one more place that you may want to take note of is this place called Alsace-Lorraine, which was basically given back to France. Right, and SAR, of course, SAAR, was placed under League of Nations control over here. Okay, over here. Right, and I'm going to close this now. Right now, and also the League of Nations basically was established in order to prevent another a war of such a large scale from happening again. Okay, we'll talk about the League of Nations a bit later on. And finally, basically the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the spirit of self-determination, and essentially there are a lot of independent countries that were created, about 9, after World War One. For example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was made up of many different nationalities. Basically, at the end of World War One, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, because they were part of the Central Powers, okay, basically the so-called bad guys, they were made to split up. So Austria and Hungary became two separate countries. Countries like Czechoslovakia and all came out of this particular empire. Alright, so I'm going to close the Treaty of Versailles. So essentially, for this particular area, you need to be very familiar with the terms. Okay, gargles, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the impact of the particular terms on Germany. Okay, and how the Germans responded to these terms. Okay, how they responded to the guilt clause, whether it's fair, whether they felt it was fair or not, the armed forces restrictions, reparations, territorial losses. Okay, yeah, essentially these 4 are the major terms that you need to take note of when we think about how the Germans responded and whether they were fair on the Germans or not. Alright, so okay, the first part, okay, was basically the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, this particular organization, the League of Nations, or LON, was created. Okay, and a little bit of background. Essentially, President Wilson of the United States of America, he proposed the creation of a League of Nations to prevent another world war from happening. But of course, his fellow American citizens were not as keen on the idea. Okay, they didn't want to get the USA involved in matters of Europe, and therefore, although he proposed this idea, the USA itself was not going to be a member of the League of Nations. Alright, and okay, essentially the main members would be countries like Italy, Japan, Britain, France. Okay, these were the main countries. Okay, and its aims, firstly, one particular aim was collective security. Okay, basically protecting one another. Okay, so all League members will work together to prevent wars and conflicts, and world peace would be achieved through international cooperation. So, for example, if a particular League member was attacked by a non-League member, other League members would come to the rescue of this particular member over here. So basically, they would form groups to help one another in case of yeah, in case of aggression, essentially. Okay, so basically the idea of collective security was meant to deter future wars from happening, because the aggressor nation, thinking about this particular concept and how the other League of Nations members would respond, would be less willing or less likely to actually carry out invasions. Okay, so international cooperation was very, very important. Alright, and also disarmament. I think we're quite familiar with this term over here. Basically, disarmament is basically the reduction of weapons. It also talks about military disarmament. So what was imposed on Germany, the reduction of troops, banning of conscription, basically reducing the militaries in each country. And when that happens, basically it reduces the member country's ability to wage war. Okay, and a few conferences were set up, such as uh, the disarmament conference was set up. Okay, in plans were set up in the 1920s, and in the early 1930s, the conference was actually held, and these conferences were aimed at achieving disarmament. Okay, through agreements. Okay, so countries will agree to disarm together in the hopes that war will be less likely to break out. Alright, so let's take a look. However, as we know, World War One ended in 1918, and in 1939, World War Two happened. So about 20 years or so. So basically, the League of Nations was not that capable of preventing another World War. Not just that, it failed in a few other conflicts before World War Two actually broke out. So we're focused on these conflicts, okay, before World War Two broke out. So some reasons for its failure. Okay, as you can see, okay, essentially you need to know two particular let's see, okay two particular incidents that demonstrates the league's failure. Okay, firstly, okay, you need to look at the Manchurian crisis. Okay, the Manchurian invasion in 1931, and also the Abyssinian crisis. Okay, so you need to take note of these two particular events and why the league failed to stop them. Okay, yeah, so essentially this one, Manchurian crisis, Japan invaded Manchuria, and of course, the league protested, okay, sent a commission down, the Lytton Commission, and told the Japanese essentially to get out. But the Japanese refused to get out, and instead they walked out of the League of Nations. And about Abyssinia was, of course, Mussolini, the Italian leader. He sent his troops over to Abyssinia, known as Ethiopia today in Africa, and basically invaded Abyssinia. Alright, and also the League, of course, the Abyssinian king, okay, he basically went to the League to complain, but the League really did nothing about it. So, for example, the British kept the Suez Canal open for the Italians to move their militaries to Abyssinia. Okay, they didn't close it. Okay, so the Italians could continue moving their troops to Abyssinia, and also things like oil were not embargoed. Okay, so Italy, basically some things were not sold to them, but crucial things like oil were still sold to them. So essentially, Italy could still go ahead, and finally they conquered Abyssinia. Alright, and then left the League later on, and then formed the Rome-Berlin axis with Hitler. Okay, so a few of the reasons for its failure. Firstly, there were structural weaknesses. So you must take note of structure. So structure means the things that are already there. Some people, they confuse membership issues or limited membership with structural weaknesses. Please do not confuse these two. Okay, structural weaknesses was basically the makeup of the league. Okay, the kind of structure that governed the league. So let's take a look at some of the structural weaknesses. Okay, firstly, there was poor organization, and the definition of roles within the League of Nations was not very clearly defined. So often the secretariat, which was basically the one that took notes, planned for meetings, they didn't have a very clear role and was very disorganized. Alright, and also the council, the security, basically the main council itself, uh, and the General Assembly, the roles also were not that clear. So the lack of definition of these roles made the decision making process very, very difficult. Okay, and that made sure that it was very difficult to enforce actions to keep the peace, which made the league very, very ineffective. Alright, and finally, decision making was also difficult due to the lack of unanimous agreement, okay, on proposed League of Nations actions. Okay, so if I add something, basically for the General Assembly, okay, which is all the made up of all the league members, there was a two-third. You needed a two-third agreement, okay, for an action to be taken, and a unanimous, which means everyone must agree. Yeah, unanimous agreement. Okay, for the council, which is basically made out of 8 particular countries at any one point. Okay, so at any one point, if they discuss, okay, two-thirds of the General Assembly, made up of 40 plus countries, must agree to that action, and the council itself, which is the top, so for example, it's like the exco of the student council. Okay, so this is the student council, this is the exco of the student council. All the exco or the council members must agree to this particular action in order for it to be taken. But because there are so many people in the General Assembly with so many different opinions, and likewise over here, 8 members, so they all have different opinions. So they often couldn't come to agreement on what action should be taken. And because of that, effective action could not be taken quickly enough, which made the league very, very ineffective. Okay, and also the lack of authority. Okay, let's take a look. Yep, okay, firstly, the League of Nations, please remember this, had no military force of its own. Okay, there wasn't such thing as a League of Nations army, a League of Nations navy. Okay, it didn't have its own armed forces. And of course, when someone else, an aggressor nation, invades a League member, because of this lack of military power, they couldn't send troops in to stop the aggressive action because it didn't have its own armed force. And therefore, the aggressor nation will be able to invade without the fear of being attacked by the League of Nations. And also, they also had a lack of economic power. Okay, so trade sanctions were ineffective. So basically, the League of Nations, although they would tell the members to not sell certain products to aggressor nations, some League members, they worried about their own economies. So for example, those who continued selling oil to Italy were worried about their own economies, okay, because selling oil was very profitable. So because they care about their own interests, they didn't stop selling oil to aggressor nations like Italy later on. Okay, and because of this selfishness, okay, they were not able to stop aggressor nations from continuing their aggressive action. So no military power, no economic power as well. Okay, the uh, economic terms are not binding on the League of Nation members, so they can follow and don't follow. It's up to them. Okay, although they were strongly encouraged to follow. Okay, so now membership issues, not to be confused with structural weaknesses. Okay, so firstly, Britain and France have been devastated by war, so they were unwilling to be involved in disputes. So talking about lack of military power, Britain had probably the largest navy in the world at this time, and France had a relatively big army, but because of the devastation of the war, they were very war weary, okay, tired of war. So they were very, very unwilling to provide the League with military power. So unwilling to get involved in disputes. Okay, so for example, for Italy, just now over here for the Abyssinian crisis, what happened was that the Hall-Laval Pact, so Hall-Laval Pact, basically was a secret treaty that was created. Basically, the British, the French, they spoke to the Italians, and they said that if you stop fighting, we will give you two-thirds of Abyssinia. Of course, it was secret, but it was made public, which made the British, the French civilians very, very angry. How can you come to such an agreement? So basically, although this thing was cancelled in the end, they didn't go through with this agreement. It basically showed that Britain and France were unwilling to be involved in disputes. They would rather appease the aggressor nations. We'll talk about appeasement later on. Okay, and of course, three world powers were absent. Okay, USA did not join, like we said, because they had a policy of isolationism, didn't want to get involved in European affairs. Germany was not allowed to join until 1926 because they were seen as guilty, okay, for World War One. And the USSR, because of their communist influences, okay, were not allowed to join until the early 1930s, so quite a long time after that. So Germany, USA, USSR, all these had very relatively strong militaries later on. They had manpower, economic power, and military powers as well. So when these three major powers are absent, basically, aggressor nations will take the League of Nations here less seriously because they know that the League was not supported by the military and economic powers of these three very relatively strong countries, okay, which made the League an ineffective peacekeeping organization, okay, because they lacked these three strong members, and also because Britain and France were unwilling to be involved in disputes. Okay, post-war attitudes of the major powers, like we said, the British and the French, although they had the capacity to get involved in conflicts, they didn't want to. They put their own interests. Okay, they didn't want to basically get involved in another war. So they put their own interests above the League of Nations. And for example, just now we talked about the Abyssinian crisis, where the British they kept the Suez Canal open for Mussolini and the Italians to bring their military supplies down to Abyssinia. Okay, that was because they didn't want to risk a war with Mussolini. At the time, they were not enemies yet, but because they cared about their own security, they didn't want to risk a war. They were unwilling to take strong action against Mussolini and the Italians during this Abyssinian crisis. Okay, so they basically were selfish after the war. Okay, and finally, because of these attitudes, they resorted to appeasement. Okay, so like I said, Britain and France were the only strong enough powers to deal with a military threat, but of course, they were unwilling to do so because they were afraid of another war, afraid of offending other countries. Okay, so they didn't want to get involved in another war, didn't want to impose military or economic sanctions. And so they adopted a policy of appeasement instead. So the Hall-Laval Pact over here is an example of a policy of appeasement. And okay, and finally, when we come to disarmament, the League of Nations members were also unwilling to disarm as they distrusted one another. So although disarmament, if everyone reduces their weapons, basically the likelihood of war breaking out will be very low. Okay, but because the League of Nations members, they were distrustful of each other. So for example, Germany and France, okay, because they had previous history, they didn't have exactly complete trust in one another. So disarmament was basically something that was very difficult to accomplish. So they basically still kept their military sizes, and because disarmament didn't happen, the threat of war did not decrease. Okay, which so basically is a failure. Okay, one of the main aims over here was not achieved, and the inability to disarm basically made the League's efforts at peacekeeping, okay, less successful. Alright, so if you just to conclude, if you look at your textbook, you see that throughout the 1920s and 1930s, there are a few incidents such as the Orleans conflict, the Corfu incident, of course these two major ones. Okay, just look through them and look through the failures. They basically scenarios of the failures and successes, a few successes, okay, of the League of Nations. Alright, so just to conclude, basically, for this chapter, you need to know about the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, its impact on Germany, and how the Germans responded. Okay, whether they felt the terms were fair or not, and whether you feel the terms were fair or not. And also over here, for the League of Nations, okay, you have to know its aims, okay, why it was created in the first place, and of course it failed. Okay, and and these main reasons why they failed. Okay, and knowing the scenarios basically helps you to gain evidence, to gain facts that will help you support your arguments, okay, in the event that you need to write an essay. So for example, when you talk about things like appeasement, okay, you can make direct link. Your elaboration would be making a link to something like the Abyssinian crisis, for example. Alright? Okay, thank you.